morning, everyone. My name is Bill Lester. I'm with the University of Florida IFAS Extension Service in Hernando County. And today we have with us Travis Chapin, who is the state specialized agent with Extension for food safety. And he's going to be talking to us all about food safety in the home vegetable garden and food safety in general. Travis, I'm just going to let you explain exactly what you do with your job with Extension. I see we have a few attendees on here, and we also should be broadcasting on Facebook Live. So let me mention to everybody who's here on Zoom with us, you are in a Zoom webinar room today, so you cannot use your cameras or your microphone, but we're more than happy to answer all your questions. If you look at the very bottom of your screen where it says Q&A, if you click on that, a little box will open up and you can type your questions in. And if you have a really burning question, Travis said, I'm more than welcome to interrupt him in the middle to get to your question. Otherwise, we could save most of the questions to the very end. And for anybody watching us on Facebook Live, you can go ahead and type your questions in under the video, the live video. And at the very end, I have my trusty iPad right here. I'll go ahead and scroll through and we'll answer everybody's questions if you have any. So let me go ahead and turn this right over to Travis and let you go ahead and share your screen and tell us all about how we can be safe out in the garden.
All right, thanks, Bill. So yeah, I am Travis Chapin. I'm an extension agent. And normally I work out of Lake Alfred at the IFAS Citrus Research and Education Center. Currently based at home in Lake Wales, Florida, so in Central Florida. But my work takes me all over the state and even across the U.S. But my specialty is in food safety and really fresh produce food safety. So I do a lot of work with produce farms. And I'm excited today that Bill asked me to talk about food safety considerations in the home garden. And Bill, I'm not able to share my screen yet. But you know, a lot of the work that I do is for farms, on farms. And when Bill asked me to do this, gave me a chance to think about you know, applying the things that I work on with farms to the home garden. And there's a lot of the things are very similar or the same, and then there's some unique things that I think we see more often in garden type situations. So I'll talk about those.
Hey, Travis, can you share your screen? Okay, if you click on share screen.
No, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, I just made you a host, so you may have to accept that. But then after that, you should be able to click on share screen.
It just told me that I'm the host now. Yeah, okay, got it.
You got a promotion.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. And I've been an extension agent here at the Citrus Research and Education Center with UF for 3 years, about 3 years. And I've actually worked for the university for almost 7 years. And before I was an extension agent, I was what we call at the University a biological scientist. So I actually did a lot of applied research projects related to looking at food safety in the produce production environment. So when we think about food safety and produce, either on the farm or in the garden, we classify the different hazards that we want to think about into these three categories: biological hazards, which are pathogens, and they can be bacterial pathogens, viruses, and parasites. The other category are chemical hazards, and especially in the home garden, things that you might think about are heavy metals, especially if you live in an old neighborhood or an old house. There can be things like lead in the soil, so you want to think about the placement of your garden to avoid things like that. And then there's physical hazards, and that can be things like broken glass or things that someone might accidentally ingest that would cause an injury. And we don't really spend as much time worrying about physical hazards in fresh produce, especially in the garden, because when you're picking vegetables, you're not likely to mix anything like that up in your harvest. In other types of food products, then that can be more of a concern. But we really focus mostly on the biological hazards. And the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they estimate that every year there are 48 million illnesses in the US, foodborne illnesses, that result in 128 hospitalizations and 3,000 deaths from eating food. And really, in kind of our new world here with COVID-19, that 3,000 deaths a year doesn't sound like a lot anymore. It used to sound like a lot, but there are 48 million illnesses, and the vast majority of those are, I don't want to say all, but nearly all are from these biological hazards, the pathogens. And so that's what I'll spend the most time talking about. I'm a microbiologist, so that's where my focus is also in most of my work. But since we are talking about home gardens, as far as chemical contamination, and Bill can let me know if you have any questions about that specifically, but I'll talk about that briefly now because the rest of what I'm going to talk about is going to be tied into these biological hazards, and I might not think to go back and talk about the chemical hazards. But really the things that you'd want to think about in a home garden, again, is things like heavy metals. So if you don't want to grow things right next to the house, if you have an old house where lead paint may have been used, when the paint deteriorates or when it's repainted and scraped, then that falls down to the ground, and there can be lead in the soil. Even in old neighborhoods, and we don't have too many old neighborhoods in Florida, but in a lot of areas where there's urban farming in the Midwest and the Northeast, where you're farming in vacant lots and there were buildings there, there can be all kinds of chemical contaminants to be aware of. You can do soil testing, but it can be very expensive if you don't know what you're testing for. If you're testing for every type of contaminant that may be there, that may be very expensive. But specifically related to lead, if you're in an area like that, there's been research on the risk of lead in gardens, and even in areas that are contaminated with lead, they found that the real hazard in that situation is when you're actually working in the garden, and obviously, especially if there are kids, just from working in the soil. If you accidentally ingest the soil, and again, specifically for kids, and even turning up dust, that's where you're likely to get the most exposure. When you are growing things, most of the lead is absorbed in the roots, and it doesn't go any further than the roots. So then you have pretty low exposure for most crops, unless potentially if you're growing root vegetables, then that might be more of a concern. There's also been some work looking at the ability of compost to tie up some of that lead and also dilute it out. And so research has shown that using compost in the soil is very effective at tying up the lead, making it not able to be absorbed into the roots at all, or at lower levels, much lower levels. And then they've also found that just by working the garden more, and turning the soil and adding some of the soil amendments and things like that, that the absorption of the lead also decreases over time, the longer that garden is being used. So those are kind of some considerations there. As far as the biological hazards, the bacteria, the viruses, and the parasites, and again, this is really where most of our concern is when we're thinking about food safety in gardens or in produce production in general. And the types of microbial pathogens, microorganisms that we're concerned about are in another three categories: the bacteria, viruses, and parasites. And some of the bacterial pathogens that you've probably heard of or maybe familiar with are things like salmonella, toxigenic or pathogenic E. coli, and there are a lot of different types of E. coli naturally occurring in our guts and in the environment, but there are some that are pathogenic, and so those are the ones that we're worried about. Shigella is another example of a bacterial pathogen. We don't see as often in produce, but in other types of food, we can see that. And Listeria monocytogenes is another example of a pathogen that we worry about in fresh produce. As far as viruses, now that we're hearing so much about COVID-19, we have to distinguish between different categories of viruses. Also, the viruses we worry about in food are foodborne viruses. We consider them foodborne, and they're not always from food, especially things like norovirus. You've heard of norovirus outbreaks in confined quarters like cruise ships and things like that. So it can also be spread from contaminated surfaces and things like that. But it can be caused by eating contaminated food with norovirus. And same thing with hepatitis A. Hepatitis A can be spread through other ways besides food, but it can be foodborne. And then when we think about COVID-19, that is a respiratory virus. So not something that's spread through contaminated food. It's spread through contaminated air and breathing that virus in. So there are different types of viruses, but these are the types of viruses we worry about in food. And then the last category of microbial pathogens that we think about are parasites. And these are less common, but things like Giardia, Cryptosporidium, Cyclospora, those are examples of parasites that have been implicated in foodborne and produce related foodborne illnesses. Of these three types of microbial pathogens, the majority of the serious illnesses are caused by bacterial pathogens. There are a lot of illnesses caused by viruses, mostly norovirus, but generally those illnesses are less severe. So we see as a percentage, at least, of the overall cases, we see fewer really serious cases that result in serious illnesses and deaths. The bacterial pathogens we see generally are more severe and result in a higher proportion of the deaths. So that's kind of how we categorize the microbial pathogens. And in the garden or in the farm, there's some, these different types of pathogens behave differently in those environments. Bacteria are unique in that they can multiply inside and outside of a host. So they don't need to be inside of a person or an animal to grow. Given the right conditions, they can grow in the environment. And that's different from viruses and parasites. Again, examples are types of pathogenic E. coli, like E. coli 157H7 is one you've probably heard of before, salmonella and Listeria monocytogenes. And again, they just need the right conditions to grow. They need water and food and a comfortable temperature, ambient temperature, and they can grow in the environment. They don't need to be inside of a human or animal. And then what we really focus on a lot in food safety in general is making sure that we minimize the ability of those bacterial pathogens to survive and to multiply by limiting those conditions that allow that to happen. Now that can be more challenging in fresh produce, and I'll talk about that later on. Viruses are small particles, and we've all gotten a lot more familiar with viruses lately, but they're small particles. They do have to multiply in a host, so they cannot multiply outside of the host. They're very small particles, and they have to inject themselves into a host in order to multiply. And for that reason, the contamination is generally linked to ill people who handle fresh produce through the fecal-oral route. But it can also be spread through contaminated water. So although they need to be inside of a host to multiply, they can survive outside of the host. And so if there's water that's been contaminated with sewage or human waste, and that water is applied to fruits and vegetables, then that can be a way to spread viruses also. In general, especially for the foodborne viruses, it only takes a few virus particles to make someone ill, potentially. And again, they can be very stable. And the key with viruses and really all pathogens is preventing contamination from those things in the first place. And I'll talk about really how difficult it is to remove contamination once it's there. As far as parasites, we see parasites even less often, but those are basically protozoa or could be intestinal worms. And again, they have to multiply in a host animal or a human. Viruses are generally more specific, host-specific. So viruses that infect humans generally need a human host, whereas parasites are less specific, and parasites in animals are pretty easy to infect humans and vice versa. They're often transmitted by water, again, that's been contaminated with human or animal waste. And although they also need a host to multiply in, they can still be very stable in the environment once they're out there. Parasites are tricky also because they can be ingested by someone and survive in the body for a very long time before they actually start causing symptoms. So it can be difficult to figure out how someone was exposed to a parasite to begin with, and then the symptoms that they do cause can be very different from person to person. So that's another challenge with parasites. So the challenge in dealing with those kinds of pathogens in produce is that we don't have a kill step often. Some fruits and vegetables are cooked before you eat them. But a lot of times we eat these things raw, and so there's no kill step. So if we have that contamination on the fruit or vegetable, then we're likely to consume that. And then another challenge is that even if we do wash the fruits and vegetables, it's very difficult to remove that contamination by washing, because there are all kinds of areas on the surfaces that really make removing that contamination very difficult. Another challenge is that contamination's generally sporadic. So especially when we're talking about these biological hazards, these microorganisms, you may have one piece of a vegetable or one fruit out of a whole crop that's contaminated, and so it's very difficult to treat all of the produce with that same level of food safety in mind. So keep that in mind. And then again, the bacteria can multiply on produce surfaces given the right conditions. And so you want to think about that, and particularly when the produce is damaged. So if it has a wound on it or something like that, then that is a way where all the nutrients in that fruit or vegetable can be released, and then the pathogens, the bacterial pathogens, can use those food sources and reproduce. So you want to think about that, and that also comes into play when you intentionally cut something up and store it. Then you're releasing all those nutrients and making it accessible to these bacterial pathogens. So you want to think about what you do with the fruits after you harvest them also. As far as the other things other than just the general environment and being aware of what you can do to reduce risk from these pathogens, the CDC estimates that 20% of foodborne illnesses, of those that I mentioned earlier, the 48 million ill, 128,000 hospitalizations, CDC estimates that 20% of those are caused by transmission from an infected food handler. So when you're working in the garden, you are the food handler. So you've cut that down drastically. Now, of that, the likelihood of infecting yourself is pretty low. But that said, there are those pathogens that are associated with infected people that can easily be spread if you're not following good hygienic practices. And generally that's through poor hand washing or lack of toilet facilities. So think about that in the garden, making sure that you do have hand washing and toilets that you use. And another possibility is working while you're sick. But then also you can be infected with these pathogens, just like we're hearing about now with COVID-19. You can be infected and be asymptomatic, meaning that you don't know you're sick, but you could still be spreading these pathogens. So good hygiene is important all the time. And along with that, having an accessible toilet and hand washing. Another thing that we worry about all the time, but particularly in the home garden, is thinking about animals. So obviously animals can spread a lot of these pathogens. And we have to think about domestic and wild animals. And so think about not only the animals who you own or, may intentionally be in your surroundings, but you also have neighbors. And if you're like me and you have a sidewalk in front of your house, people are walking their animals and they're peeing through the fence and all that sort of thing. And then there's wildlife. So think about all those things. And then the other consideration is, even if the animals aren't directly in your garden, that contamination from animals can still be tracked through your garden through movement from your own shoes or from other animals. Like if you have a dog and livestock, the dog's running through the pastures, and then if they follow you into the garden, they can be spreading contamination that way also. Water is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about in the farm environment. It's a really good way to spread pathogens through an environment. In the garden, usually we're using drinking water, so that's not really a concern. The only thing to think about is if you're capturing rainwater and using rainwater in the garden, think about how you use that rainwater. Because that could be a concern depending on how you're applying that water. So applying it to the soil on a crop that's growing above the ground it is much less of a concern than if you're sprinkling rainwater onto leafy greens or something like that. So think about where the rainwater is coming from the roof, and you have birds and squirrels and everything running all over the roof all the time, and so that would be a way that you could spread that contamination directly onto the garden. So think about if you do use rainwater, think about how you apply that in the garden. I mentioned compost earlier when I was talking about folks who are looking at using compost in urban gardens where there's a concern about lead, and compost can be effective at minimizing that risk from lead, but also have to think about the biological hazards that might be present in that compost or those soil elements. So again, if you're making your own compost out of vegetable scraps and things like that, plant material, that's very low risk. When you start using manures and things like that, then that becomes much more of a concern. And so you generally try to stay away from that in a home garden. And if you are doing those things, just make sure that they're properly composted and that you're achieving a time and temperature to minimize the risk of any pathogens that may be present in the materials. But using plant-based compost is a great way to continue to build the soil while minimizing food safety concerns. And then the other thing that we really spend a lot of time talking about on farms and in other food production environments are from contaminated surfaces. And there's a lot of touch points in a lot of vegetable and fruit production where fruits and vegetables touch a lot of different surfaces and pieces of equipment. Much less so in the home garden, but I can remember when I first started gardening, before I was ever thinking about food safety, and I did a lot of things that, looking back now, were really kind of dumb. But when you have a bucket laying around, think about what you're going to use that bucket for, especially when you're using buckets to harvest your crops from the garden. So you don't want to use dirty buckets and things like that, especially if you have animals that are using those containers for other things. And same thing with shovels and other tools, especially if you do have animals or livestock. Don't use the shovel that you use to clean out the chicken coop, in the garden. So think about things like that. And then the other thing in the garden, think about standing water. That obviously is an attractant for birds and other potential garden pests. Also a great way to spread contamination if it is present. Tracking through that water, splashing that water can be a way to spread contamination to the garden. And then think about any debris that may be laying around. That can also be a area where pests can take up residence near the garden. So as far as the overall picture and assessing your risks, again, think about the location of the garden and the adjacent land, and the different risks that may introduce to your garden. Again, fecal contamination is really one of the main things that we think about in fresh produce production from wild or domestic animals. And again, how you use water and manure or other compost in the garden and what the sources of that are. Making sure that you're using the right toilet facilities and washing your hands when you need to. Thinking about how your tools and equipment might spread contamination, especially if you're using those things for multiple things. And then think about things that you don't intend to happen, like flooding, or think about where if you have a septic system, where that is, and the risk that may introduce to wherever you're growing things. And then the other thing that I did want to touch on, because I have seen some washing of fruits and vegetables, and I've done it myself, that's really not ideal, especially for gardens. you know, a lot of times we do wash our fruits and vegetables, even in the garden, before we bring it in. And that is really another great way to spread contamination through uh, contaminated water. And so I mentioned earlier that the contamination in the garden or the field is usually very sporadic. But if you do have that one contaminated piece of fruit or vegetable, you put it in a tank of water, and then you put all the rest of the fruits and vegetables in that water to wash them, then you're spreading that contamination across you know, your entire harvest. So think about, if you are washing anything out of the garden, think about how you do that. If you just use single pass water, meaning, you know, you're washing it with water, passing over the fruit or vegetable, not captured in a container, then of course that's, if you're using fresh water, not rainwater, then you don't really have much risk of transmitting that contamination to other pieces of fruit or vegetables. When you get into trouble is if you're using a big bucket or some other kind of container and dunking everything in there to wash it, then you really want to think about your use of water there. And how often you change that water. So obviously, the more frequently you change the water, the better. Think about how dirty the water is getting with dirt and other organic material. How much of your harvest has gone through that water, and the types of things you're washing. Obviously, root crops are going to be a lot dirtier than other things. But the less shared water you have, the better. So again, just think about those different risks and kind of prioritize them in your garden, and think about the different potential sources of contamination and how it can be spread, and just minimize that. But in the grand scheme of things, you know, the overall food safety risk here is very low. And you have a lot of control. The benefit of you know, gardening is that you do have a lot of control over what you do. So as long as you're, you know, following you know, kind of these practices, then your risk is very low. Especially in the grand scheme of things of the other health scares that we have going on right now. And I will be happy to take any questions right now. You can also contact me through email at tkchapin@ufl.edu at any time too. And of course, if you work with Bill Lester, then he can also get a hold of me.
Okay, great, Travis. Thank you very much. That was very informative. We have like a question or two here, and then I thought of a couple other questions as you were speaking. Some things that I've been asked before, or a lot of it is things that I read on Facebook, because if you want to read some really bad advice,
yeah,
and potentially sometimes very dangerous advice, you see it quite a bit on these Facebook groups from people who just don't know any better, really. So let's look at the questions that we have here on Zoom. So what if your irrigation system is using well water? Is it safe or unsafe?
Yeah, so there's all different types of wells and well water, so it depends, but in general, wells are usually pretty low risk. You might, depending on, you know, if you're using this well for drinking water and you know, making sure that it's appropriate for drinking water, then of course there wouldn't be any concerns using that in the garden. If it's just a well that you use for irrigating the garden, then you know, you might want to think about, if you have concerns about it, you might want to test the water and look at the construction of the well and the location of the well, and see if there's any routes that potential contaminants could enter the well. How close is the well to your septic system, or you know, things like that, where it might become contaminated. Has it ever flooded? Things like that. But in general, groundwater is pretty low risk. But certainly not, you know, risk-free,
Hmm.
but much lower risk than if you were irrigating out of a pond or something like that.
Yeah, I know that I work a lot with septic systems, and there are rules and regulations about how far from your septic system your well needs to be. But if you live out in the country, older house, you have a well that you're using just for irrigation,
Right.
maybe somebody else put in without a permit, you need to look at all those things. And here in Hernando County, if you're ever curious about your well water, Hernando County Health Department does well water testing for pathogens, for the bacteria and the pathogens. They'll check for those. Now, I'm not sure what their process is now with COVID-19 and not being able to visit their office, but if you contact the health department, and for people in other counties that might be watching this, if you contact your local health department, they could probably help you out with that. So, is adding a cleaning agent to our water for rinsing garden vegetables recommended, such as vinegar? And is it safe to let my children nibble from the garden while playing?
Oh, okay. Yeah, this is a really good question, especially the first part. And I'm sorry that I didn't think to address that in the presentation, because that is something that has come up a lot lately, especially with concerns over COVID-19 and things like that. Uh, Washing your fruits and vegetables in, you know, again, best case is in running water, not submerged in a bucket or anything like that. But that the best case is just washing in plain running water. Um, and washing in just plain tap water is, you know, just as effective as anything else that you might add to it. And actually, if you're adding vinegar or anything else to it, you're not going to be using running water. You're going to be using a bucket or something. So then you may actually be making it worse. But those types of things are generally just not very effective. If you were using a bucket, then I would recommend using a sanitizer in that bucket, something like chlorine, properly, you know, at the right concentration and the right type of chlorine and things like that. But generally for a home garden, it's much easier and much more straightforward to just rinse it in running tap water. And then you don't need to worry about spreading contamination and using a sanitizer and things like that. As far as cleaning agents, that's also, you know, detergents and soaps and things like that. There was a doctor, some kind of doctor on the internet on YouTube, encouraging everyone to wash their fruits and vegetables in detergent, and that's actually not recommended. Those types of soaps and detergents are not designed to be used on food, and the residues from those can actually make you ill if you do consume them. So it's better to, again, just use plain tap water. And then as far as eating things directly from the garden, again, you know, you don't need to wash your fruits and vegetables. And again, I talked about how just washing them is not a very effective way to remove contamination once it's there. You really want to make sure that you're not, when you do harvest things, that they're not, you know, visibly contaminated with some kind of animal waste or something like that. But otherwise, absolutely, you know, eat things out of the garden.
Okay, we have a question from Facebook here. What about reclaimed water? How would I know what type of water comes out of my hose?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that for that, you'd really want to talk to your utility and see, and they would, depending on what it is, they probably not suggest using reclaimed water in the garden. But there's a lot of different types of reclaimed water, and so you'd really want to make sure you ask your specific utility provider about what kind of reclaimed water that is and what they suggest appropriate use of that water is.
Yeah,
So
as a
it
general
depends.
rule, nobody recommends drinking the reclaimed water. And there
Yeah.
is reclaimed water runs, you know, a wide gamut. You know, reclaimed water in one town is different from another town, different from your county. I know here in Hernando County, we don't have a lot of reclaimed water, but we do have some in some neighborhoods. And it is clean to a certain extent, but exactly how clean, you need to contact the utility or the city or county that you're getting it from to find out from them. As a
Right.
general rule, the reclaimed water is not recommended. It's not clean enough to be overhead irrigating your vegetable garden or drinking or having the children, play in out in the lawn. And that's going to vary from municipality to municipality. And I thought up a question or two here from when you were speaking. You kind of already covered one or two here, but I know that people will also like to raise chickens. So is it safe to have your chickens running around your garden? Some people think, well, 100 years ago, people had their chickens running around and they used raw animal manure and they never got sick back then 100 years ago.
Yeah. They got sick. They just didn't know it was the chickens.
Exactly. They had a shorter lifespan back then too.
Yeah.
So it might have been, a little bit of that.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's something that I would not recommend. There have been a lot of cases in the past couple of years of people getting infected from their chickens themselves, not even from something the chickens may have contaminated, but just from petting chickens and getting baby chicks and things like that. So chickens, again, they can be infected with pathogens like salmonella, and the chickens don't get sick, but they can spread those pathogens and pretty easily, obviously, if they're loose in the garden. So I don't recommend that. I know a lot of people like to use them for pest control, and I've seen people allow them around the perimeter of the garden, fence in the perimeter. That's obviously better than letting him into the garden directly, but there's still a lot of different ways that the pathogens from those chickens could get into the garden, when they're that close to it. So definitely something to think about and be aware of, and probably try to keep the chickens more separate. And also think about, a lot of Florida is flat, but if your chickens are uphill from the garden, that's another way that could spread contamination from runoff. And I've seen that too. So.
Okay, and we got one other comment here on Facebook. Cindy says that Pinellas County does not recommend reclaimed water for garden vegetables. And I wouldn't think that most municipalities would. I've never heard of one that recommended reclaimed water for food.
No, I don't think if you asked them, probably none of them would say that they recommended that.
Okay. And the only other thing I thought of is for anybody who lives next to a little pond, retention pond, lake, you probably don't want to pull your irrigation water if you're growing food out of that.
Yeah, I would, especially if it's a retention pond where it really is designed to catch runoff from, all kinds of different places, people's yards with pets and from parking lots and things like that. That would definitely not be an ideal water source for a garden. Ponds depends on, where the water from the pond is coming from, thinking about runoff the same way you would with a retention pond. If it's a natural pond that's, protected somewhat from runoff from other potential sources of contamination, then it might be okay, but definitely something to be more careful with than if you're using groundwater or drinking water. And again, that's something that you could test to give you some idea. There are recommendations on levels of what we call indicator organisms, and that would be a whole nother presentation, Bill, but there are ways where you can evaluate the potential safety of surface water and using that. So it can be used, but something that you want to be more cautious with than groundwater or drinking water.
Yeah, if you're not sure, you definitely want to be
And again,
careful with that, because these are things that you're going to eat, you know, and feed your family.
yeah, and a lot of it depends also on how you apply the water. So if you're applying it through a sprinkler where it's coming down directly onto all your fruits and vegetables, then that would be the highest concern. Um, if you were putting it through drip tape or something like that, then of course you have to filter it so that it doesn't clog up the drip tape. But then as long as you're not growing root vegetables under that drip tape, then the risk of contamination, even if that water is contaminated, is very low. So you have to think about how, if the water is contaminated, how could it spread through your garden?
Okay, well, I think that's about all the questions we had here, either through Zoom, and let me double check Facebook. Yep, I think we've covered them all.
All right.
So thank you very much, Travis. I really appreciate this.
All right.
And
Thank
if
you.
anybody has any further questions, you know, just feel free to contact us. We're here to help. We're here to answer your questions. So, Travis, thank you very much once again. I really appreciate it. And everybody stay safe out there, and be sure to follow us on Facebook to keep on top of all of our different classes that are coming up. So